This movie is full of tips and tricks, especially for knitters on Corona knitting machines. This is a relatively rare vintage knitting machine, and they're actually very nice machines, but they are a bit unusual. So as I have gradually become more expert on them, I thought I would share the things that have helped me. Most models of knitting machines, I have knitted on quite a lot of them of the same model. This is not one of those cases. They're rare enough that this is the only one I've ever had hands-on my own. However, I have consulted with other Corona knitters, and these seem to be common issues, and therefore worth sharing. At this point, it's knitting wonderfully smoothly, but such was not always the case. I'll share with you what went on and how I got from there to here. I'll be using a composite yarn, which is something of a challenge for the machine, but it's what I want to knit with. It's also a yarn that knits at the high end of the dial. I'm using a Marion Nelson saddle shoulder pattern design in case you're curious. And here it is almost finished, so you can see that I did indeed have a success with these yarns on the machine. Here I've just hung a hem, so of course I've had my hands on the stitches and the needles, and I've disarranged them just slightly. On many machines, I just straighten them by hand and go about my business. This machine is kind of picky about position. Therefore, I have learned if I have messed with the needles at all, I just push them all into all the way forward position and knit the next row back from hold, which the machine does without a fuss. The all the way forward position of this selector is the one that allows it to knit back from hold. You'll avoid a lot of dropped or unknitted stitches with that simple correction, and it's no problem at all. Take note of this. This is, I think, an electrical clip. I actually found mine at the grocery store, oddly enough, but hardware stores have them. This machine has a tendency that is apparently due to its construction and stitch making mechanism to argue about knitting off the end stitch. It's enough that it's even mentioned in the manual. It's particularly prevalent in the very first few rows, which are of course curling under here, so they'll get in the way of themselves knitting off. My normal solution to pesky edge stitches is to hang a claw weight. The manual says not to use weights, however, but naturally I tried it, and they're not kidding. This machine does not like them, does not knit especially well if you utilize them. But I found that these are little enough weight to keep the fabric coming down out of the way and not disturb the machine's ability to knit. Now, based on what I told you before, you can see having messed with these stitches, they're not perfectly even, and my best bet is to bring them out to knit back from hold before I proceed. We're in the position that will do that. Beautiful. Here's something to watch out for. Suddenly, my knitting acted peculiar. I'm using a composite yarn. It's made up of 3 individual strands, and one of them got a little bit caught right there. So I'll need to go off camera and make sure that they're all running through the same place in the tensioner. One of the most annoying problems I had that persisted for quite a while was a tendency to do what you see here, skip several stitches. This would occur without apparent reason, and quite a few stitches in a row would seem to randomly fail to knit. I puzzled a long time over those edge stitches and the tendency to skip a few stitches in mid-row without any explanation. Most of it turned out to be solved with proper cleaning and oiling. When I got it, this machine didn't look very dirty. This is the underside of the carriage. But it had been in storage quite a long time, and you have to clean and oil ones that have, because even when there is or was proper lubrication and cleaning, the old oil tends to get hard, and everything on this planet wears out. And that will make everything that's supposed to move sluggish. If the wrong flipper is sluggish, it will prevent the stitches from forming. And that's pretty much what was happening, I think. The first cleaning and oiling solved more than 90% of it. Things move all around under here, depending on what your carriage settings are. There are tons of things that move in any carriage. So if you're trying to troubleshoot and look for why you're having a failure at some point, definitely checking that all the flippers move and move with pep is a good idea. What finally made this one get to work and behave itself for good, the first cleaning and oiling solved 90% of the problem, but not 100%. And so while I was not using it, I dripped a little ballistol. This is a very pure gun oil. Not all gun oil is suitable, but ballistol was recommended to me, and it has worked for me. Every place there was a moving part, I would drip just a drop down into the shaft and leave the carriage sitting like this, upside down. And then the next time I came back, I'd wiggle everything and work it manually. And it gradually loosened up. We've been looking at the carriage on the C setting. Let's move it to T. And now different things are moving. So we need to try all of the settings, drip oil into the area of any post that holds a flipper that you suspect of sluggishness. And one of the things that can happen is a tiny bit of oxidation can form on that post where you can't see it. So it's not knitting dirt, but it is impacting the flexibility and peppiness of the flipper. And that will in turn affect the knitting. And gradually, usually the gentle oil drip, wait, then turn over, drain it, brush it out, and repeat, will usually work out all of that old oxidation or corrosion or whatever it is. In this case, it did. And one final thing did the trick for me. It's when I noticed this. This carriage threads on like any other. There's a lip on what is basically the sinker plate that fits around. But it's a good tight fit, but it rides. It's not locked on. So we can do this at any time to escape from a mishap. It doesn't pop back down. With that in mind, you can see how if your posture is not just right and you're not pressing your hand with a downward motion, you could inadvertently be faintly lifting. And I think that that will affect both end stitches and a tendency to skip. For one thing, I noticed that almost every time it skipped, I was hearing a funny noise. I think that's the noise of this. Did you see me slightly lift the carriage? Is it not really riding anymore? And it should sound, well, like nothing if there are no needles. I don't want to knit a real row, so let's do this. See, there's a slight whirring sound as each needle knits properly. But as it doesn't, there's more of a clicking. You know, I think that I'm not very tall, and I was sitting a little bit too low for my table, but I was okay, I thought, except for I don't think that I was pressing the carriage with the correct downward pressure. So I think if you keep in mind that it's not that it requires a lot, it's just to discipline yourself to avoid any upward pressure. Having learned that, I'm not having any trouble anymore. I should mention setup. I actually do have the table clamps, and they hold it in a slanted position, much like a ribber. I can't get it up there right now. But if you don't have them, you can do what I'm doing here. This is that rubbery shelf lining. I've found if you double a piece of it and place it on the table, Make sure the edge is pulled back enough that it's not in the way, snagging your fabric. This machine actually has such a light touch with the carriage that it will hold still without clamps, just with this non-slip rubber. Here's another interesting feature. I just noticed my row counter had quit counting, so I had to count the rows manually and reset it. Probably when I turned over the carriage, I accidentally depressed this. This is the row counter trigger or tripper. It's installed here properly, but it's a somewhat unusual setup to put it into work. This will give you a free pass on the counter. You knit, but it doesn't count the row. There are occasions when you actually want that. This is what causes it to come out far enough to move that little lever. It's time to do my underarm bind off. The transfer bind off works about the same on this as on any machine, except that the needles tend to feel looser. Pull back, pull forward, get the stitch on the tool and off of the needle, bring it over, and this is a challenging moment. This needle goes forward and back. It's not a big deal. You can certainly learn to get comfortable, but here's another thing. If I control the fabric with my fingertips, I'm pulling it down a little bit and controlling the needle butt with my right fingertip, the fabric with my left fingertip, and because I have done this without a tool lots of times for other reasons, I find that might be a little bit more comfortable when working from the left. I'm not as good at it from the right. But I have one more to do, so let's do it the traditional way. You can still use your fingertips to help. Actually, I still have another to do. Make sure all these are thoroughly out of work. And now I'll knit to the right. But first, I'm going to keep this out of mischief with my little clip. And now we'll go do the underarm bind off on the right side. Here's a case of that stitch did not fully knit off. I'm just going to manually pull it through properly. And since I've messed with the stitches, next row, I'll let them knit back from hold. If you have a Japanese machine, you'll be accustomed to binding off around the gate pegs. The absence of gate pegs means we can't do exactly that thing, but we can do something close. Hook to hook, pull back, so now that stitch is on my tool, make a chain stitch, forward, hook to hook, pull back, make a chain stitch. The problem is there's nothing holding the rest of the fabric steady, but we can fix that. After 2 or 3 stitches, bring forward a needle correctly positioned to stretch this fabric just a little bit. There we go. It's not difficult. The camera's just totally in my way. You won't have the trouble I just did. And here's the stitch I was in the process of moving across and binding off with. And now it gets easier. You have to tension with your hands a little bit more since there are no gate pegs to automatically tension. But it's not an especially big problem. So if you want a chain stitch bind off and you're not a fan of the transfer bind off, which also produces one, or like me, you find one is easier with one hand and the other technique is easier with the alternate hand, this is something you can learn to do pretty easily. Now I need to work some full fashion decreases, and you face pretty much the same challenges as with binding off. there's no problem. It's the same technique basically as on any machine, but the positions of the needles are likely to change on you. I have found it helpful at this point when I'm about to release the stitches and the tool from the old needles to give it a little flip. That way, when you move over by one needle width so that the innermost stitch falls on the next needle over and the outer two fall on the two empty stitches, leaving the doubled up stitch here. The point of that is that I opened the latches with my tool, and because of moving the stitches and the needles to and fro, they were probably open as these are next to them, but they may have shifted while I adjusted and picked up my stitches. So I found that to be really helpful. If they're not open, you can always reach with your tool and open them, but this saves a little time. Just remember that upward flicking motion, and most of the time they'll stay where you put them, so when you fish around to pull them out, you can. Let me do that for you one more time. Line up the tool on 3 needles, pull forward, pull back so that the stitches have slid onto the tools. At this point you really can't see the needles, but I flicked up and hoped for the best, and they're pretty much open. And then bring forward to knit back from hold for 2 reasons. One being the behavior of this machine is always better like that. The other is that with a doubled stitch on here, and especially with my yarn, which is in the heavier end of what the machine will do, I'm making it easier for the machine to knit this back. And there it did nicely. Let's do this one more time for clarity. Line up the tool, pull forward, pull back. Before completely releasing, flick the tool upward. See that get caught? That's a hazard of a multi-stranded yarn, but I was able to rescue it, no problem. Move over, replace, pull that one out of work, pull these forward. Sometimes we all make mistakes and have to rip out. This is the easiest machine for unraveling rolls that I have ever used. To keep the stitches from jumping off, I do find it helpful to add a claw weight during the ripping process. We'll remove it as soon as we're done. Then just tug on the yarn, which shortens the stitches, and lift slightly, and off they pop. This is the manual diagram for threading, and it's not just like my machine. There was either more than one version, or this diagram is highly simplified. So I kept experimenting until I found a way that worked for me, and I'll show it to you, even knowing it may not be the original method. Let's take a good look at this tensioning device, because it's a little bit different than most. Instead of 2 discs that the yarn passes between, these floppy things provide the tension. I'm going to thread it for you with the yarn that we would not actually use with it off of the machine. This is bigger than we would use, but you can see it better because of that. First location, over, under, lift the tensioning device, and from here it goes into the tension wire. So the combination of the flopper and the wire working together produce the tension on the yarn that's necessary to knit smoothly. Slide it into that slot, over the bracket, under the next bracket. There's a slot here and here into which the yarn should lay. So I knitted happily away, knitting the majority of this sweater with total success, and suddenly the yarn started misbehaving. I double and triple checked that I'd been threading just like this, and I had, and I couldn't figure it out. But edge stitches were failing to knit off, and I could tell the tension was too tight because when I felt the yarn, that was the problem. So the question was, why had it suddenly changed? I kept tugging on it gently to try to diagnose, and I could feel resistance as though the yarn was catching on a burr. I can't reproduce it when it's lying on its side like this, but it really was. So I've been examining all around for burrs and didn't find a thing. I finally noticed this. There's a little pad of something rubbery, and the side that I was using, the side you see, had lifted up a little. And I thought, could that be it? Maybe I should glue it down. And I flipped it up to look at the condition, and now I think we can see what I need to do. There's some rust under that pad, and I can only assume a little piece of it got in the yarn path. It would take so little if it flaked off and hung around right there. This is kind of fuzzy yarn. So I think the thing for me to do is brush this with a soft brush or possibly see if Magic Eraser will clean it up. Obviously we want to get rid of the rust and then reattach my little rubber piece. That's a thing I did not even know to look for. But if it happened on one, it may happen on another machine. And I do not know how well this will come across on video because I have this enlarged enormously so you can see it at all. Right next to that piece of rust is a little nick in the plasticky rubbery thing. And that could also have been a player. So I'll smooth that out with an emery board.